The next presentation will be from Lisa Falco. Lisa is head of product at Pipra, a Zurich-based startup developing an AI tool for predicting post-operative delirium. Please, Lisa, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And so I will dig right in. So post-operative delirium is something you've probably never heard about, but it's incredibly common. It happens to about 20% of all patients above the age of 60 after they had a surgery. And post-operative delirium is when you wake up after surgery and you are very confused to at many different levels. It can go from the very extroverted way of delirium, where you start pulling up the tubes and running around on the ward and annoying nurses, but or it can be a passive delirium where you're very apathic and you simply lie in your bed and don't move at all. And it can have some really severe consequences as well if this happens. So it's not only very unpleasant for you, yourself, and your surrounding, but it's also can have serious long-term consequences. For instance, it doubles the risk of being admitted to a nursery home if you suffered from this. It costs the healthcare system in Germany alone, it costs 1 to 2 billion euros. The mortality rate of patients with POD, it's 25% within 1 month of the surgery. 38% of all the patients that suffer from POD, they are still suffering consequences 9 months after the surgery. And globally, this affects 59 million people a year. So this is a huge problem. It can be prevented by good nursing care in the ward, but this costs a lot of money. And it also requires a lot of compliance and extra work for the nurses. So they don't have time to do this for everyone. And that is where our solution come in. It's an app and an AI tool that predicts, based on the patient's medical history, it predicts the risk of developing POD after the surgery. And then the nurses can much better target who they should focus their efforts on. And by doing so, you can have a large prevention of delirium, which not only reduces suffering from the patients and their surrounding, but it can also save a lot of cost for the healthcare. To develop such a tool, that's what I will talk about here. I was wondering a little bit exactly what I would talk about, because the algorithm itself are not incredibly cutting edge, but the big challenge here has been the data. Whenever you work with medical data, the main difficulty is to have high quality annotated data so you can train a supervised system on them. And this you can basically only get within clinical trials. And if you want to develop an AI tool, you need a huge amount of data. So what we did to acquire this data is that we went through all the literature that is out there on POD, and we contacted all the authors individually. And we reached out to way above 100 different authors of clinical studies. And we got data from more than 20 of those, wrote us back, and were willing to share their data. So we managed to build a database of over 20,000 patients. And this is the largest and the richest database worldwide on POD. And this is true, and it is definitely our pitch, because it sounds amazing to have so many patients, right? But as data scientists, I hope you have all understood by now that just because you have a lot of data does not mean that you have a lot of good data and that your journey goes without a problem. So the challenge many of you have maybe already foreseen this, but we have data from 20 different studies, and they have not all tracked the same parameters. Some of the parameters are almost always there, like age, for instance, but a lot of these predictive parameters have simply not been tracked in all the studies. They have actually not even tracked the ground truth in the same way using the same methods. The sizes of the different data sets varies tremendously. The biggest ones were thousands of patients, whereas the smallest ones were around 60 patients. It also covers many different types of surgeries, even within the same study. We also don't really understand if there's some other bias in the studies and what of these data we can actually trust. So you see, there are really many challenges when you're dealing with this data. So what I want to talk to you about today is some of the methods that we have used to assess these challenges that we get. So for the first one about the ground truth, the bias, and the data, which data we can actually trust, our go-to solution has always been a very, very close collaboration with medical doctors. Without them, we would not have been able to do anything. So we had medical doctors going through all the original studies in very deep detail. And they found rather quickly that many of those studies that sound amazing to us on the paper had to be excluded because the outcome tracking have not been done in a correct way. So we couldn't use the outcome, and that means that we would have nothing to train against. And also you can understand the problem if you have some that are very careful, find this even the slightest signs of delirium, and you put them in the same pot as someone who just detects delirium. If the patients go completely berserk, it's just not consistent enough to train on. The bias in the study, on the other hand, we could not really solve. So we know that we have a lot of patients. They are mainly European whites or Asians, but we do not have an incredibly diverse data set. However, we do have data from more or less all over the world, especially Europe and Asia, and also Australia. Another thing that has a bias, since POD is depending on the nursing measures that we have, that depends that it can vary a lot from hospital to hospital because we don't know how the quality of the care is in a certain hospital. And that is also something that has not been possible for us to assess in this study. So these are the biases we'll have to live with and can't deal with. Other issues that we had about the difference of the data sets and different parameter tracks. Again, we had to use our medical doctors to help us translate one parameter from one study. For instance, there are different scores of comorbidities, how many additional diseases you have on top of the one you're being operated for, how you can translate one score to the others. That was a lot of work trying to harmonize the data set and get as many common variables as possible. We also had the issue that these larger studies dominate a lot. So if you have one study with 1,000 patients and you have another one with 100 patients, if you put them together, if there is one parameter or one predictor that is very strong in the smallest studies, but it's not present in the big data set, how can you make sure that that this one is seen? Because it won't really have a big impact on the metric when you're trying to train the thing. So what we did there is that there was a lot of work in training models on each and every one of those data sets individually and come up with which parameters were the most important. And then we did a kind of semi-manual feature selection for the final model where we had therefore manually said, so this this parameter was important in this study, and therefore we made sure it came into the final model. The issue with covering different surgeries, the problem there is that we know that the type of surgery is a risk factor, but the information we had of each surgery was basically the name of the surgery, and we had too many different types. We had hundreds of different types of surgeries, and that was just impossible to put this in as a categorical variable. So what we did again was to mobilize our medical doctors to give us different types of rating systems of these surgeries. So either it could be linked to the severity, or they grouped them into subgroups, and then we tested all those different groupings and rating systems. Together, and then we did a feature selection, and then we came out with a rating system that was the most beneficial to predict the outcomes. The algorithm itself, as I already warned you, it's not the most cutting edge. I think logistic regression that we use has been around since the 50s, so it's not going to make you jump on your chairs. We tested all algorithms, or not all, of course, but most of them. We tested random forest, we tested gradient boost, we tested neural networks, and they more or less performed very similar. Maybe because our data set in the end, after we'd done all this adaptation, it was not so huge. So we ended up with about 2,000 patient data out of those 20,000. But the reason then, when they all performed the same, we chose logistic regression, because when you work with medicine, the more you can explain what's really happening, the better it is. And logistic regression has an incredibly straightforward interpretation. You see directly the weight of every parameter that goes into the model, and you can tell which parameter was it that pushed the patient into a high risk group. Then here you can also see the results. What you see to the left is the area under the curve per study that we had. Because since one of the issues was that we didn't have all the variables for all the studies, we saw that the performance really went up when we had many variables. We used 9 parameters in the end. The reason also why we only had 9 and not 30 when we had that is because the doctor actually needs to manually enter the parameters, and so you need to keep it at a decent level. And once we passed 9, we didn't have a huge increase in performance of the model. But we can see also that the performance increases significantly with the number of variables that we have available in the data set. And in our external validation, we validated in a study we had not seen before with 7 variables. And there we had an area under the curve of 0.77. So the important question here is, of course, is this good enough, or is it not good enough? And therefore, we made you can make a calculation of how much does it cost for different thresholds of the output of the logistic regression. You can see when you cut everyone below 0.2, for instance, you say they are not at risk, and the ones that has higher than a risk of 0.2, they are high risk, and then you make a prevention of them. Then you can see what the cost is of of treating everyone compared to not treating anyone. So by that you can simply see that even though 0.77 might not sound amazing, it can actually lead to very significant cost savings for the hospitals. And this is what the tool looks like, the product that we're bringing to market now. We are going through regulatory approval. It's a very easy, intuitive tool with sliders, buttons, that immediately gives the risk for the patient. So the main takeaways that I want to give you along from my talk is that it's so important to know everything about the data. You can't just treat the data as, in medicine at least, you cannot just treat it as just numbers. You really need to understand where it comes from to be able to treat it in the right way. And you need to talk to your stakeholders. In our case, that are the medical doctors. And also, you don't need the fanciest algorithm to change lives. Often, the simplest solutions are the best one. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. And that's it from my side.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It was very interesting summary. Great. We received few questions. The first one was, what data were the most important factors to predict the POD?
So you can actually see them all here on my, you still see my screen?
Yes.
So these are all the factors that came in, and age is a very important risk factor. The older you are, the worse it is. BMI has an opposite. So the thinner you are, the more at risk you are, actually. If you have previous cognitive impairment, turn out to be very important one. How many different medications you're on, and a lab value that is a CRP. CRP is a measure of infection that you already have. So it's believed that post-operative delirium is actually an inflammation in the brain. So if you already have an inflammation beforehand in the body, it's more likely that it spreads to the brain.
Yeah. So the next question, usually health-related data is private. What kind of privacy laws did you have to deal with to obtain or use this data?
So first of all, the patients, when they were participating in the clinical study, they had already written over the rights here. But also, we went through a university that were anonymizing all the data. So it was completely anonymized by the time that it came to us. And then we had an ethic approval as well. But as it was I hate that word, anonymized, yeah, we were allowed to use it with the ethics. Yeah.
And one more question. What is the false negative rate that you could achieve with this solution?
Yes, I can show you back when, but it depends on where you choose now on the rocker. Now I only had on the external one with only 7 variables, but when we made internal validation of our data, we had so our optimal point, what we found was a sensitivity of 80% and specificity of 70%. But in the end, you'll see here it's always a trade-off that we actually want the hospital to make, because there's one point which is a sweet spot in terms of money cost saving. And that will also depend for the hospital how much it costs for them to do the prevention and how much it costs to actually treat the cases. Here we have calculated that it costs 800 francs to prevent POD, but it costs 5,000 if it happens. So either it's a cost calculation that might be different from hospital to hospital, or it's also an ethical. I mean, in your ideal world, you would say you would give all the patient the treatment, the prevention, but then, well, you wouldn't need our tool. But on the other hand, it would be good for the patients, but it will cost a lot. As you can see here on this orange line, it will be very expensive if you put in the prevention treatment on everyone. So it depends on where you choose your threshold. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lisa. It was very interesting.
Yeah.
And now we make a small break, lunch break with all our participants, and it would be nice you could also stay in our lounge in Town and um, feel free to speak with your neighbors and have nice discussions. And we will meet each other at 1:15 for panel discussion on data and ethics. Thank you very much.
Thank you.